Jay, welcome to the show.
Hey man, so glad to be here.
I've been writing and looking into heart rate variability biofeedback devices for a couple of years now. And until I came across your device, there wasn't anything quite like it on the market. So I'm looking forward to chatting about heart rate variability and what you guys are building.
Yeah, man, excited that you came across us and happy to discuss Hanu.
Let's start off so far today. What unusuals or non negotiables have you done for your health and performance?
Oh man, how much time do you have? My morning routine is it's pretty staunch. It's like set in stone, and it's one of those things that like basically it is like all non-negotiable. It is a set and a pattern of behaviors and habits that have been instilled for many years now, and I've kind of refined them over time. But I'm in a really good groove right now to where like it's pretty much again set, and I think I've done the same thing now unchanged for probably the last, I'd say, year and a half. All right. So the non negotiable number one is that I roll out of bed and the first thing I do is I take a cold shower. Now, that sounds probably very unappeasing and unappealing to a lot of people, but that is a non negotiable because if I take a warm shower, it feels good. And sometimes I'll start off a little bit warm and then go to cold. But really, the thing that I need, especially as an early morning riser, waking up at 5 a.m., like I have to just like get that really good shock effect because I try in whatever way possible to delay caffeine. A lot of the information that Andrew Huberman's released about delaying 90 to 120 minutes afterwards, after awaking, I try to do that, but I'm not always successful. But the one thing that is helpful is just blasting myself with cold, getting that really big dopamine release, that big norepinephrine, epinephrine release. It's a great way to start the day. So that's number one. Number two is I'll go downstairs and I always start my morning off in a just very quiet, like silent room. And it's typically downstairs in my living room. And I will actually do two things. Number one, and this sounds like, what you would expect to hear me say, I check my heart rate variability. Like a lot of times I'll check it in when I'm in bed before I do the shocking routine of like getting the cold water on me. But like, as long as you're consistent, it really doesn't matter. If there was something that precipitated when you take it. Now, I always tell people don't do caffeine prior to taking HRV, but like my morning routine of shower is so habitual that my body just knows it. But I will go downstairs and I'll take anywhere from about a 60 to 90-minute reading of my heart rate variability. And a lot of times I like to compare those numbers with what's on like my Oura or my Whoop or my Garmin. Like I wear so many things that I'm tracking data, but I use obviously Hanu as the mechanism for taking it. So we call it Snapshot in our app. And I'll look to see where I'm at. And a lot of times that will help me to just kind of understand my overall recovery and kind of where I am starting. It will sometimes, depending on the data output, will dictate how I work out that morning because I always work out in the morning, generally around 6:30 or so. And that will kind of dictate it. I'm sure we can dive into how and why and what interpretation I make there. But that's one thing I do. The next thing that I do after I check HRV is I'll just do short, anywhere from 2 to 5 minutes of breath work, and that is a non-negotiable for me. That is just a great way to prime and condition the nervous system to settle down. To not be on this bad boy, the phone or whatever. Something stimulating because that's always beckoning. Like it's always calling me. It's like emails, go, work, go, and it is just an amazing time for me to center with the breath. And then I spend generally around 30 to 45 minutes journaling, doing some gratitude journal. I always read The Daily Stoic, which is by Ryan Holiday. It's just a really short Stoic reading. I also will incorporate some other types of reading into there. It's generally on stoicism or philosophy or psychology, something that really just helps me to take practical suggestions and practical advice throughout the day. And I kind of center my focus on that. But that's it. And then I hit the gym. And that's another, basically a non-negotiable every day. I'm either doing zone 2 cardio or I'm doing weight training or resistance training. It's basically one or the other, almost 7 days a week. Some days I'll take a day off, but it's basically 7 days a week because I'm kind of rotating between doing cardiorespiratory fitness training, zone 2, zone 5, or I'm doing resistance training. So I know that was a lot. Again, I told you how much time do you have, but my morning routine, like they're kind of all non-negotiables, and I make sure that like they are there. And if they're not there, I don't let it ruin my day, but I can certainly notice a difference between it being there and it not being there.
Yeah. I'm amazed how much overlap we have between our morning routines. And sometimes I'll try and take things out, I'll try and compress them a bit. And I end
Right.
up returning to the same things, the same durations. Like, okay, this is what I need. I can't shortchange it that much and still expect the same outcome.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Can you give us a overview, like an elevator pitch? Why should someone track their HRV? And then after that, we'll go into your background and more about how you got interested in all this.
Yeah. Yeah. So I always tell people that heart rate variability is a little bit more complex to understand than heart rate, but people generally understand what heart rate is. It's basically the average amount of times that your heart is beating at any given minute. So BPM, beats per minute. So that's easy. It's basically an average of things. Heart rate variability is really looking at the time differences or the variance that occurs in between successive heartbeats, because we know the heart doesn't operate like a metronome. It has to adapt to trillions of processes at any given moment. And so, therefore, an adaptable cardiorespiratory system, and we take it a step further and we say an adaptable autonomic nervous system, which is responsible for us either conserving energy or expending or mobilizing energy. We call this either our sympathetic or fight flight response, and then our relaxation response, more commonly seen in the scientific field as the parasympathetic response. We know that it's got to adjust well to everything going on internally or externally. So the greater the variance that occurs, or more heart rate variability, we know the more adaptable your nervous system is. The best way to kind of explain this too is that we took a 30,000 foot view. We see heart rate variability is the single greatest non invasive proxy for assessing the dynamic shifts and changes in the nervous system. Another way to put it, even more easy for people to understand, is that we can use heart rate variability as a mechanism to look at where the nervous system is at any given moment. Is it stressed? Is it taxed? Or is the nervous system actually in a reparative or a recovery mode? So if somebody is looking at HRV every single day, well, now we have something to compare to. And that's really what HRV is all about. If you take it in one single context, that number is essentially useless. I mean, there's nothing that you can really do. If you just sit down one day, you take your heart rate variability reading for 60 seconds, whoop-de-doo. Like, it doesn't give you anything because it's outside of a context, right? And the context of heart rate variability is always looking at a comparison to what your normal baseline is. And so over time, the more that you take it and the more consistent that you are in examining heart rate variability, we're kind of looking at one of two things. The first thing is we can view heart rate variability more from a recovery perspective, because we know that if we're not working out, then we should be at least priming our bodies for recovery. So heart rate variability in terms of recovery looks to say, well, how well is our nervous system adjusting to all the stress that we put on it? Because if you're exercising, you're putting stress on the body. It's a great thing. Stress is inherently good. We want to have that happen. But then after the stress has been removed and we're not exercising, how well is the body repairing itself? I mean, we know that's how we get bigger, faster, stronger, is that we recover well. Yes, we have to work out well, but we also have to recover well, which is probably more important than the workout itself. Well, maybe not, maybe 50-50, because if you don't work out, then you're kind of just always recovering, and that's not necessarily a great thing. So when we look at heart rate variability, we're saying, okay, is the nervous system saying, I'm repairing every single day, like I'm going back to my baseline, like we're good to go? Or maybe even I'm going above my baseline, I'm repairing really well. Or are we starting to see a trend where heart rate variability is actually shrinking? It's getting lower, which again is indicative of the nervous system saying, I'm feeling some taxation, I'm feeling some overuse, some overreach, and I'm not having enough time to repair because I keep getting stuff thrown at me, and I'm having to adjust the best way I can, which is basically to stabilize myself and to maintain whatever level of homeostasis I can. So heart rate variability goes down. So again, that's kind of a way that we can look at it in terms of recovery. And there's a bit of nuances there that I'm sure that we can discuss. The other way is that we do kind of what we do with Hanu, is that we take more of a mental health approach, and we're looking more at how is heart rate variability changing all throughout the day based on context. Because again, context is key here. If I were to see, your heart rate variability drop, from 50 down to 10, and then I see your heart rate go from 60 up to 90, without context, I don't really know what's happening. You could be pretty freaking stressed in front of your computer, like because, something's making you anxious, or you just got up and you walked to the bathroom. You get up and you walk to the bathroom, heart rate rate variability is going to go down, heart rate's going to go up. And the same thing could happen if I read a scathing email. So within our app, where we're looking at these continuous shifts, the other things that we're priming for or we're looking for is for you to provide us the level of context, for you to tell us, okay, what was going on there? And then was that subjectively affecting your overall mood, your overall sense of well-being, or not? Because you going and walking to the bathroom, like, no, I'm good, I'm neutral, or, I was feeling pretty relaxed. My nervous system was responding as if I was being stressed, because you were walking. So therefore that's technically stress on the body. It's not, again, stress is not bad. And we can talk about why that is too, because a lot of people, I think they confuse stress with being this bad thing, when it's not. It's actually inherently a great thing for us. But then, there's a difference between that and then, like, maybe you were at the computer and all those biometrics changed. And now you're saying, no, man, I was freaking stressed. Like, my boss just sent me like a really awful email, and it was really, really ramping up my nervous system. And I didn't know how to respond. So I was getting sweaty, palms were getting clammy. Like, there's, again, two different subjective experiences and two different subjective, or I would say objective circumstances, and then completely same objective data output. So context in the state of HRV and looking at any biometric, honestly, it is the king. It is the absolute thing that we need. I know that was a little bit of a long-winded answer, but really HRV is important for really kind of those two reasons. But more of the 30,000 foot view is that we really have to have, or let's say it's really important to have a good understanding of where our nervous system is at any given moment, so that we can look at how well are we adapting, how resilient is our physiology to stress at any given moment, and then we can self-regulate accordingly.
Yeah. So the big applications currently are to assess nervous system status, which then gives you insight into your recovery, your mood. It helps you draw correlations between cause and effect, I guess.
Yep.
But then what else? Like, I know that there's some talk about this in like longevity circles, and also to like improve sleep and other facets as well.
Yeah, 100%. So some of the greatest research in looking at heart rate variability monitoring and heart rate variability biofeedback has to do with how does it affect your overall stress response, and then therefore affect longevity or affect overall outcomes. So the greatest thing that we've come to in looking at heart rate variability training, heart rate variability monitoring, is that we know kind of two different components that I want to talk about. One would be its relation to glycemic variability, and the other would be its relationship to overall self-regulation and mood and self-control, and more so emotional regulation. So let's talk first about glycemic variability. So one thing that is very clear, if anybody puts on a CGM or they use NutriSense or levels or anything, is that you can see that when even outside of any type of nutritional input, we actually can see that blood glucose can raise significantly due to stress. But also, too, the things that we do put in our body, especially if they're causing a lot of glycemic variability, can also result in the body responding as if you are stressing it out. So the greatest kind of for instance of this is that I did a lot of testing with levels over the past few months and comparing it to Hanu. And one of the things that I see consistently is that, again, outside of nutritional input, if I have an influx of glycemic variability, if it goes up, heart rate variability linearly will go down. It's this really beautiful negative correlation. On the flip-flop as well, it's not really a flip-flop, but I would say that if I intake food that raises glucose, you see it as well. And a lot of people ask, well, what's going on there? Like, why is that? Well, key point number one is that anytime that you initiate eating, you're mobilizing energy. So it takes a lot of energy for you to chew. It takes a lot of energy for you to swallow. It takes a lot of energy for these processes of digestion to start. Afterwards, then actually your parasympathetic nervous system is going to be the key driver for digestion. So you really want it activated. If you have an overly activated sympathetic nervous system, this can cause some significant GI distress. And that's kind of its own world, but one that's very, very important and shouldn't be left unattended. But the one component that you have happen here is that when blood sugar significantly rises, we see this significant inflammatory response that can indeed occur. And one of the main culprits for this is mass activation of cortisol output and epinephrine output. And we know that cortisol, again, is one of those, it's an interesting hormone, again, that's very useful, will save your life, but also can be quite to your detriment if it's secreted too much and too often. And the main problem we see arise here is that when cortisol is being released, we also know that that activates the release of a lot of blood sugar within kind of our overall circulatory or artery system. And then we see there also will be an influx of insulin. So it's the combination of insulin, cortisol, and blood sugar all in one that causes this significant inflammatory response. The body goes into hyperdrive. It says, like we've got the stressor that's going on right now. And that's reflective in all of these other types of biometrics going up. So when we think about longevity and we think about overall health optimization, continuous spikes of blood glucose or a lot of variability in your glycemic fluctuations, this can cause really significant impacts on your overall stress response and can lead to a heightened inflammation that causes significant damage and concern. So it's one thing to look at. Now, the other component that's really interesting in the longevity space is looking at the key components of self-control and emotional regulation. And we know that while stress is a significant concern for most individuals, even though they may not admit it, most people have significant stressors that impact their overall well-being. The one key variable that we find over and over and over again that's very much related to heart rate variability and heart rate variability biofeedback is that if we can increase our ability to control our nervous system, we call this autonomic control, which we condition through things like HRV biofeedback. The greatest output of that, or the outcome of that, is that we learn better emotional regulation. So not flying off the cuff, not, screaming at your kids when they, say something or do something you don't want them to do, or, flipping the bird off to somebody in your commute because you're in such a rage, or any of these things, writing an email like off the cuff that you hit send and then you immediately regret. Like all of these things continue to wear down on our health. And we know that poor emotional regulation leads to significant physiological concerns. And that can be reflective in somebody's nervous system. Like we see it when someone is emotionally upset, whether they're angry, frustrated, if they're overly anxious, heart rate variability will drop like a freaking rock. Like they just see it. Like you can just see these numbers dip down. So when we do a heart rate variability biofeedback, our biggest thing that we can help people with is learn how to better control that response. Will that mean you never get frustrated? Of course it doesn't. Will you never get anxious? Of course not. You'll experience emotions because that is what it is to be human. However, the great component of this is that you can indeed turn the volume down on the frequency, turn the volume down on the severity, turn the volume down on these externalized outbursts that come, the things that we always regret after we experience emotions that aren't really adaptive for us or fruitless or they're not very helpful. So heart rate variability biofeedback, as you know, Nick, is a key core component of what we do at Hanu. That is all with the intention of increasing our emotional or self-regulation so that these stressors that we inevitably will encounter in life do not impact us as negatively as what they would if we didn't learn that level of autonomic control. And again, the end result is that we're going to add years onto our life, or I should say at least time onto our life, or at least we won't subtract time for our life. I don't know if we can add, maybe we can add. We would like to think so in the health optimization community. But the biggest thing is that we're not taking away time from our life. And we know that will happen if we're not regulating our emotions well, if we have poor self-control, poor impulse control. And the research is very clear that HRV biofeedback and HRV monitoring can be an extremely, or I should say is an extremely valuable tool for instilling that skill acquisition.
Yeah, it's funny. I was just thinking back through when I got my first CGM and I was working some probably 12, 14-hour days back to back. And I felt a little bit of stress in the moment. But if you asked me about it, I wouldn't have said I was very stressed. But the numbers didn't lie. I thought the sensor was broken because of how high it spiked. I think my measurements were like 80 nanograms a deciliter to start with. And then once I started doing that work for a couple days, it was up hovering and staying steady around 120, 125,
Yep.
way above my baseline. And then I was like, okay, maybe there actually is something to this whole notion of stress being biologically detrimental that everyone hears, but until
100%.
you actually see it yourself, it's hard to actually grasp that you don't necessarily feel hyper stressed, but certain things can have that impact on you. And then
Yep.
also the emotional regulation side. Like it's not sexy to admit that our emotions drive our behavior, and whether we choose to eat, whether we go off and do some destructive habit, whatever it is. But those two pillars, being able to manage those, although it's not the flashiest thing out there, it's incredibly valuable.
Yeah, it's you make such a good point there, and the really interesting thing is I have a very similar story. So a few weeks ago, I was wearing my CGM, I was wearing a Dexcom, and I also had Hanu on, so I got to watch both of them. And I was in an unfortunate wreck in my car, and I was actually been in a fast, like I didn't have any food on me. My wife was with me. Luckily, we were okay. Car's fixed. We're good to go. But the data were so freaking interesting. I was before the wreck. I was kind of about where you were. I was like right around 77, 78 or so blood glucose. And then I went up to close to, it was like 130. And that was outside of any type of nutritional intake. You just see this huge spike. And I'm like, there we go. That's the wreck. And then I looked at Hanu and I saw heart rate variability at the start was whatever it was. I think it was right, maybe around 50 or 60 or so. And we got in the wreck and boom, down into almost the single digits. It was like 11 or 12 milliseconds RMSSD. And I was like, that's it. And I was like, that's it. And, I recovered really quickly from that. It was like, blood sugar came down really quickly and, my heart rate variability and heart rate stabilized not too long after that. And so it's moments like that, yes, we're kind of training for, but those aren't the detrimental moments nearly as much as the repeated stressors that cause continuous spikes in glucose and continuous dips in HRV. One of the things that we tell people in Hanu, and you'll see too as we build this more into the app, we got the newest version that will really highlight this, is that for people, we're really trying to keep your HRV stable. We want you to be right around your baseline. We're not trying to keep you up all the time, and we're trying to minimize the continuous spikes down below your baseline. Because when we have these continuous spikes, those are that's the detrimental impact of your physiology, kind of just going from energy mobilization back, energy mobilization back. And if that happens repeatedly over and over and over, especially as a result from psychological stress as opposed to physiological stress. Like you're going to have those happen if you get up and walk to the bathroom or if you're exercising, it's inevitably going to happen. And those are good things, but it's the constant repeated exposures from psychological stress and back to, again, the component of emotional dysregulation that causes the most significant or deleterious effects on physiology.
Okay, so assuming most people aren't using HRV to understand the impact of collisions and other relatively extreme events, what are some of the common factors that elevate or plummet HRV?
Yeah. So there are so many things, and it's all also dependent on the individual, right? Because there are some things that are going to be result in your stress response going up that may not result in mine, and then vice versa. I might get stressed over things that you don't. So it's really context and personally dependent, which is why it can be sometimes hard to kind of measure, and it's why we also don't compare to others. And we can get into kind of those components here. But the one thing that I will say is probably the key component that most people don't notice, or it kind of goes, it's overlooked, is dysfunctional breathing. I would say that dysfunctional breathing is the primary key component to HRV dysregulation that most people don't realize, because a lot of people, when they get inside or they experience kind of this stressful event, and it could be a big stressor or a little stressor, is that we tend to revert, I won't even say revert, because that would be going back to what we used to do, which is not. We actually will move to a position of breathing that tends to be very thoracic or from the chest, maybe even from up in the shoulders, We tend to mouth breathe when we're stressed and breathe very quickly. So we kind of go into this full level of dysfunctional breathing as opposed to functional breathing, which is nasal breathing only. It's breathing from a low, deep movement of your diaphragm, not from your shallow chest. It's not quick, it's slow. That's the biggest shift. And we see this with Hanu, that a lot of people, when they get stressed, they will change over to this form of breathing. But then when we intercept and we say, okay, now I want you to shift your breathing, to use better mechanics, to engage in better biochemistry, and to change the cadence of your breathing or slow your breathing down, we see these crazy influences in overall heart rate variability, but also subjective experience. It's like, it's kind of like cliche when you hear somebody just say like, slow down and take a deep breath. It actually freaking works. It's the funniest thing, because you're like, it sounds just like too easy. And you're like, no, isn't that the greatest aspect of this, is that it's easily accessible. You can use it anywhere. Like, you don't have to have a device on. You just slow your breathing down, change your mechanics, and it's going to be effective for you. The great thing about Hanu, or what we use Hanu for, is that we give you that level of objective data to show you the effect. And that helps with you conditioning that response. That's really what HRV biofeedback is so helpful, because when you see it in action and you say, oh, wow, this is not me just subjectively feeling better. Like, look what happened to my physiology. Like, my heart rate variability started at 20, and then I just did 2 minutes of breathing, and now it's at 40. Like, I just doubled my HRV in a matter of 60 seconds. That's really freaking compelling to people. And it's great because it helps with that conditioning response. So dysfunctional breathing is one. We mentioned nutritional input, which really can highly fluctuate people's glycemic variability, but also their nervous system response. Another one too is that when people are overly sedentary, so when people are overly sedentary, we know this can significantly impact their overall recovery, but also their nervous system. Sometimes I have seen individuals, especially those who are battling, unfortunately, with depression, who have basically just made themselves hermits and will not go out and socially isolate themselves. We actually see a significant inflation in our HRV for these individuals. Like, their parasympathetic nervous system goes into hyperdrive. And this is actually not a good thing. This is not a good position to be in. If you're doing biofeedback and you have this really nice inflation of HRV, like, that's a really good thing. But if it's coming from more or less you being overly sedentary, then that's actually an overdrive of the parasympathetic nervous system without activation or good activation of the sympathetic nervous system, which can be a high motivator, can results in a high level of epinephrine and dopamine release. So those are actually things that we want to have happen. So it's like a combination of like being overly sedentary, which is what most people are, but also overactivation of the nervous system by putting in too much time in the gym and overreaching and overtraining, which we already hit on. Another one, which is what I think is probably the biggest killer of HRV, is when people get into routines and habits of seeking contentment but not finding it. And that may sound a little bit esoteric, so let me explain a little bit. One of the modern day pandemic of overall mental health and well-being is spending so much freaking time on the phone, so much freaking time looking at social media, doom scrolling, like just being immersed with this false sense of reality and this false sense of connection. And we've seen so many individuals that get immersed into that world, which is more people than not, probably, is that this can really tank people's nervous systems. Like, we see visceral stress response occurring when they're doom scrolling on their phone, or when they're, just kind of immersed in social media. They're spending 6, 7, 8+ hours on their phone. I think that's a big hidden one. And people are looking for a sense of contentment, because I think that's what a lot of people are seeking for. They are having difficulty in their life. They don't have a sense of joy, a peace, and hope, and they're trying to find it in whatever way they can. And for a lot of people, it's distracting themselves. It's kind of mindlessly immersing themselves in these worlds. But the unfortunate thing is that this is causing us to feel more disconnected, to feel more stressed of the things that we do not have, that we want, that we covet, that we wish were a part of our life. And it is just wreaking havoc on people. Mostly, a lot of the younger generation, but it's not just them. It's basically all generations. And it's a really unfortunate thing. So I think that's another big one. And then the last one that I'll mention too, before I take a pause in my own breath, so I don't get too dysfunctionally breathing, is that the biggest one I think would be, or the last biggest one is when people do not focus on areas of their health and well-being that are paramount to health and well-being. And the number one culprit is when people have poor sleep or they do not prioritize sleep, because you can do everything in the world for overall mental well-being and physical well-being, but if you cut things short on sleep and you don't have good quality and good quantity of sleep, and you're busting an ass for all day long, get 2 hours 3 hours of sleep, and it's really broken nasty sleep, it's going to impact overall mood. It's going to really kill heart rate variability, and it's going to knock years off your life. I mean, the research is so clear that, like, if you're skipping out on effective sleep, like, you're gonna die young. Like, it's just it's an inevitable medical fact. And people might be able to skate by for a while, but it will eventually catch up to you. And the old adage is, like, I'll die, like, I'll sleep when I'm dead. It's like, no, you'll actually die because you didn't sleep. And so, yeah, I don't think that's probably a good mentality to have. So, yeah, sleep prioritization is like one of my number one, if not my number one thing, that if people are not doing that, I would say before we start anything, before we do anything, which heart rate variability monitoring and biofeedback can absolutely be a component of getting better sleep. But we have to say, let's stack things up and see what can we do to get better sleep. And then we can learn some more advanced techniques in order to gain better autonomic control. With sleep has to be a priority.
I actually use that same adage about dying earlier by not sleeping. And if I'm completely honest, I didn't sleep all that well last night. And when I checked my heart rate variability this morning, it was a little lower than usual. And it doesn't help that I compounded that by working out yesterday.
Yep.
But for people that say, I get X number of hours of sleep, say 4 or 3 or 2, and it's fine, and it's when I naturally wake up, do you have any like tricks to realigning the circadian rhythm like that?
Yeah, it's I've heard it before. I work with prior to starting Hanu, I owned a consulting firm where I worked with a lot of high performance athletes, a lot of Fortune 500 CEOs and executives. And these are all hard chargers. The athletes will prioritize recovery and sleep way more than like the high functioning businessman or woman. Like they can be the worst about it, because they're like, I've got a business to run. Like, it requires me to work, 18 hours a day. Like, they're just like, that's the mentality. And I love the drive. I love the motivation, but also too, like, you see the detriment that occurs in all of their health and well-being. And it's not just like their physiology is a little bit out of whack. It's like their psychology is out of whack as well. And it leads to really poor decisions and poor behaviors. And it can be a disaster thing. And then when you finally have them convinced, if you will, that significantly changing these behaviors will impact their overall performance and help them to be better at what they're doing, make them more money, like, whatever, fill in the blank, whatever their life goal is, like, then they'll start to kind of realize, oh yeah, well, maybe I should make some of these tweaks and changes. But sleep is one of those things that, like, they tend to just not prioritize. And they're like, well, can I pay for some supplements or hack it this way, or, get this light panel or do whatever? And I'm like, all those things are great, but we should probably just get to the basics of getting good quality sleep. So a lot of the things that I teach in regards to helping the nervous system recovering to get better sleep are quite simple, and they're quite free. So the first one would just be consistency. So you set a time that you're going to bed every night and you keep it, and you set a time that you're waking up every morning and you keep it. This is simple, like cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia 101 is like sleep time, to bed and then to wake up, and it's every day, 7 days a week. Not like you don't function and change it on the weekends. Like, if you're waking up at 5 and going to bed at whatever 10 o'clock at night, You're doing it on the weekends too. Consistency is key because that is going to help us to really increase our overall sleep drive, or that drive for sleep. The other one, which is probably, this is a non-negotiable, and this is something I do every single day as well. I didn't mention it earlier, but it is a non-negotiable, is getting anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes of direct sunlight every single morning. I mean, that is a non-negotiable. I almost always do it in two ways. One is I'm outside, obviously, because inside, like trying to get it through the windows is not effective because windows typically will block different rays of UVB, UVA. Mm-hmm. So I go outside, number one. Number two is that I do it barefoot in the grass to get some level of grounding. And then I'm walking. I'm always movement. Movement is key. And this is really going to be the biggest Zeitgeber, or way to reset the circadian clock. And we actually see too that when people engage in this type of behavior, they typically have a better heart rate variability response because they're really aligning themselves with the day, with circa. So the next thing that I always have people do is timing of food. That's a key one. A lot of these businessmen that I refer to, and businesswomen that I referred to earlier, they would eat super late at night. I mean, I'm talking about like, they'd work till 10, 11 o'clock at night, sometimes later if they were a night owl. And then they almost always would be like, well, I'd have a nightcap, alcohol. We'll talk about that because that's a big one here in a second. And then they'd always eat some type of food. And they'd be like, well, it was protein. I was eating, chicken, or I was eating steak, and then I would just immediately go to bed. And I'm like, okay. So yeah, the biggest thing would be creating a fasting schedule before bed, and for a lot of individuals, we would just have like hard set times. Like we start dinner at 6, and once we're done with dinner at 6, like it's it. We don't eat anymore because we know from plenty of research that fasting prior to bed is extremely important to give the body enough time to start digesting. Because when it gets to sleep time, yes, you're still engaging in the process of digestion, but we have a lot of other great processes for recovery that need to kickstart as well, and we don't want to give an overabundance of energy over to digestion. So we would see people, with their heart rate would be, they would eat dinner at whatever. So I won't say eat dinner, they'd eat a snack at 11 or 12 o'clock, and their heart rate would be up in the 60s, and it would take a long time for it to come down. Whereas opposed to if they stopped eating at 6, and let's say they went to bed at a decent hour, 10 o'clock, we'll say, which is, probably it's early. I mean, I say that's a good time for me. It's late for me, actually. Might be super early for others, is that they would get in bed and their heart rate, instead of being in the mid 60s, would be already down in the mid 50s. So heart rate variability wouldn't take nearly as long to elevate, and for the individual to recover nearly as, it wouldn't take them as long. So that's a key component that I have a lot of people do. The other one would be caffeine and alcohol. So we know that nightcaps, even drinking in the evening with dinner, even if it's one glass of wine, is going to impact your nervous system. It's going to increase overall heart rate. It's going to diminish recovery. Now, am I saying never drink alcohol? I'm not throwing that out there. Like, listen, people are going to make their own choices. A lot of people will drink socially. They'll drink in whatever context. Like, if that is your thing, I don't think there's enough evidence to say that there are enough health benefits from alcohol, from wine or beer or anything to like say, yeah, I can justify it every night. So I would use it sparsely. And the reason being is because if anybody has ever drank alcohol and looked at their Aura score or looked at their Whoop score, whatever, they're going to see it is impacted. The sleep architecture is impacted, a lot less deep sleep, more choppy sleep. So they wake up more throughout the night. Maybe they have better onset of sleep because they're more relaxed, but their choppiness of sleep increases in the amount of times they wake up. And then we'll see a suppression of heart rate variability. And a lot of people see heart rate variability really low and maybe then scale upwards like as the night goes on, but they will see a suppression in heart rate variability. Same thing with caffeine. I would say putting a good cutoff time to it. For me, I drink and consume 0 milligrams of caffeine after 12 p.m. Like I just do not do it after 12 p.m. Before then, I only drink maybe 1 or 2 cups of coffee each morning. I just try to limit it because for me, If I drink any more than that, like with my Hanu, I will see that it dysregulates heart rate and heart rate variability for a significantly longer time than if I do not drink it. So for me, I like to get the good buzz feeling of like I'm energized, I'm ready to go with a cup or maybe two max. And then after that, I'm good. Like I do not need anything more because my nervous system will be a little bit wrecked. I'm a little bit more jittery, and I just typically don't metabolize coffee as fast. And so I don't want to have that leak into my sleep. So we do that. And then if people are looking to utilize a so-called hack for sleep, obviously, I don't even think it's a hack. I think it's just a natural part of who we are as humans is that limiting light exposure later in the afternoon, getting good quality throughout the day, all day long, as much as you can, getting good quality sun in the eyes, on the skin. It's a beautiful receptor for overall light. And then as the day progresses and light outside starts to dim, then internal environments should follow suit as well. And if it means changing the tone and color of light or the dimness of light within your setting, that's great. Some people would choose to utilize blue blocking glasses. That can work effectively as well. So all those things are great. So light exposure. And then for me, the number one, if you want to call it a hack, I'm okay with that. Number one tech that I use to help with sleep is my chili pad. Just being cold at night, I notice a significant difference in all of my biometrics: better deep sleep, better REM sleep, better heart rate variability, and then better resting heart rate when I use my chili pad as opposed to when I do not. And I have mine set on a schedule. It's the newest one, the whatever Doc Pro or whatever it's called, where like I'll have it, really, really cold when I get in, and then progressively I'll warm up a little bit because I don't like waking up being like freezing in the middle of the night, because I like being freezing when I go to bed. Like I like a really cold bed. But I see that that's like the most effective way for like really helping with overall recovery and increasing HRV.
Yeah, and it has an effect that just having a cool AC in the room can't replicate. But back what you were saying a second ago about the light, I think that's also really important. It's a staple in my morning routine. Every day I'll get out there, I'll walk around, usually shirtless, regardless of time of the year, get some of that natural sunlight. I'll read, I'll move all at the same time. But a big part that I often hear overlooked is people wear sunglasses. And while that can be helpful later in the day, that has a similar effect of being in front of a window where you block certain crucial spectrums of light, including, I think it's UVB, which is really important to help set the circadian rhythm.
Yep, 100%. So yeah, ditch the glasses. Yeah, like you said, later on in the day, like it can be effective, especially if you're spending a lot of time outdoors. There's going to be some people who argue against that. But I think the non-negotiable, the thing that's really hard to argue against, and I probably don't think there is a good argument, is wearing sunglasses first thing in the morning. And, again, I think there's, depending on who you talk to and who you ask, there could be some potential benefits for looking maybe in the direction of the sun. I won't say we're looking directly at the sun. I don't want to lose like my license as a practitioner for like telling people to look at the sun, but there could be some benefits in that. But especially if you're not wearing protective lenses over your face, and if you're looking at the sun with sunglasses on, you're just kind of stupid. I'll call a spade there. But the non-negotiable is no sunglasses, walking around, getting as much sunlight on as much skin as you can, and then obviously within the eyes.
I don't have a medical license, so I can mention my own experience. I do sun gaze for the first 15 minutes of the morning when the UV index is 0. I will not do it once the UV index is a 1 or above. If there's any pain, I'll immediately stop. I researched and eventually ended up experimenting with staring directly at the sun for the first couple minutes of the day. And I found it to be incredibly grounding and therapeutic. And it's an awesome way to start the day.
Yeah.
But that's a whole nother conversation.
I like it though. I mean, the one component that I will say that is amazing about it, and this is not referring to necessarily even the direct physiological benefits, but it's the mindfulness benefits that you get when you look at a sunrise or a sunset. I mean, just being present and being in the moment. And then also too, there's this stoic concept that I love, which is all about bathing in beauty and just looking at nature and those things that are around us, and not being, facing the phone, but just like being there and present and noticing just like the beauty of what is in front of you. It is art everywhere. I mean, I know, again, that might sound like esoteric or woo-woo, but there is art everywhere in nature. And the sunrise and sunset, especially if you have the ability to do it like over the ocean, oh my goodness, like there's just nothing better for a mindfulness practice for me. Like that's my home.
Yeah. All right. And to contrast the esoteric with the quantified rationale based thinking, when you were mentioning alcohol consumption earlier, I know when I got my Aura Ring, that was one of the first effects I noticed was that it just destroyed a lot of my different biometrics. And I know that people often wonder how they actually use the data they get. So with Hanu and with HRV in general, how do I put these biometrics to work and actually like change or make decisions based on what I'm seeing?
Yeah, yeah. The practical application component is like the most important component for us to discuss. So I'm glad that you brought that up because HRV is one of those biometrics that a lot of people like understand a little bit, or at least they have a basic understanding, but then like doing something with it is the one thing that a lot of wearables have not done a good job with. And that's where Hanu is trying to come in and say, we want to give you something practical to do with this. And this is what we're continuing to mold within our app is like, we want to give good data that leads to really good insight and direction and then leads to amazing outcome. Like that's kind of like our whole, mission statement as to what we're doing. The one thing that I will say about, utilizing heart rate variability is that key component number one is understanding context and understanding what you are comparing to. So the thing that you're always comparing to when it comes to heart rate variability is your baseline. So within our application, after a certain amount of time that you wear it, it gets better the more and more you wear it because we understand more and more of your data is that you will find what is your baseline and then what is your upper ceiling and what is your lower shelf. So basically like what is that in between zone that's like your baseline zone. Your mean or the average is really that middle point. And for us, what we want to see is like during certain events or within certain circumstances or within certain contexts, what is happening to your nervous system and how are you adjusting well or maybe not adjusting well. So it may be for individuals like when they drink or consume alcohol, you get that really great for some, you get that really great euphoric feel initially. There's a fair amount of vasodilation, so the blood vessels are opening. And if you actually drink, so let's say something like wine, which is full of nitrates and nitrites, then you're going to get even more of a increase in nitric oxide production and more of a vasodilation response. What we see accordingly is that there are changes significantly in blood pressure via what's called our baroreflex mechanism. These are specialized baroreceptors or stretch receptors located in two locations, the carotid sinus and then aortic arch of the heart, which are responsible again for like these pacemaking abilities and blood pressure basically homeostasis. And we see that when people drink alcohol and have this vasodilation response, increase in blood pressure, then blood pressure can become dysregulated within this baroreflex mechanism and heart rate variability will sink, heart rate will go up. And this can last depending on how well or not so well you metabolize alcohol for an extended period of time. So there are some individuals who I've met who like you can see like on their overnight Aura scores, heart rate variability and heart rate are not affected that much. Like it's affected with alcohol, but you don't see kind of like this. Like with me, I'll tell you, like if I drink alcohol, I will see a higher heart rate, and it will be a progression throughout the night. I'll see HRV start right here and then go up all throughout the night. There are some people who I have seen like their HRV will be like low, but then it will just spike up like after a little bit of time because their metabolism is so fast in alcohol. Heart rate will be up, and then it'll just spike down really low when they go to sleep because of how quickly they metabolize. So it just depends on the person and how it's impacting them. No matter what, I guess the end of the story is that it's going to impact you no matter what. It doesn't matter if you're a fast, good metabolizer of alcohol or not. So that's the thing to look at. The thing though is that we just need to know though, how is this comparing to my baseline? Like, is it significantly like causing these massive dips in HRV, whether it's what you're eating, because you can utilize it to look and see how is nutrition affecting my overall nervous system functioning, whether it's alcohol consumption, caffeine consumption, experiences or events and how that affects nervous system. We're always looking at the baseline. How is it moving or shifting away from my baseline, or maybe helping to kind of keep things consistent? Because if it's keeping things around your baseline, then it means your nervous system is actually pretty adaptable. Like a stable heart rate variability actually equates to adaptability. low heart rate decreases, and especially when you stay low, it means that you're having having a lot of difficulty adapting to the thing that you're experiencing. So again, context is key, and then always understanding where are you in comparison to your baseline. And this can help you make decisions on whether or not you're overtraining or overreaching. And you look back historically and you say, oh, well, maybe it's because I ran, 10 miles one day. And then the next day I followed it up with another 10 miles. And the next day I followed it up with 13 miles. And it's like, okay, I can kind of see like what's impacting my nervous system. Or maybe it's like, dude, I've had 14 straight days of like hardcore powerlifting and my HRV is tanking like a rock. Okay, I think we're finding the culprit. And you remove that thing or you modify and you see what happens to your nervous system. Are you still on a downward trend? Or do you find, oh man, this is actually positively impacting and I see better recovery of the nervous system? So the greatest thing is that when you are experimenting with Hanu or really any other type of device, is that you do indeed put on that scientist investigator hat and you run everything as if it were an experiment. And you have a hypothesis, you test it, and then you retest, and then you reformulate your hypothesis and over and over again. And so I think it's a matter of just testing, understanding the context, logging the context. Like if you're using Hanu, we call that life events, and just seeing like, what are those things that are impacting my nervous system? How is it impacting? Because if we send you an alert, which is something we're building into our app, when we push a notification to you and we say, hey, it looks like your nervous system was really being affected, like you don't have to do the hard work of saying like, oh, let me go track and see where my HRV was. We'll tell you, we'll say, yeah, this significantly moved away from your baseline. What was going on there? And you can say, well, yeah, it was really tough, work meeting that I had and my nervous system was going bonkers. Or, I was just going to the bathroom, like just kind of had to pee. And so therefore, like, okay, we're good. And then also looking to see like what was the subjective experience. All of those things in combination give us a really good overview of, again, the context and the events and how is that affecting us both objectively and subjectively.
You said that you want your HRV to be relatively stable over time, but acute stressors, say going to the gym and having a brutal workout and then recovering, aren't you going to see a lot of fluctuation if you do that, say, a couple times a week? You're going to see a trough and then a huge spike and then another trough.
Yep, 100%. So yeah, when I was referring to stabilization, I was talking about more when we refer to like active rest, or if we're kind of more in a rested state. So for me and you sitting right here, though we're talking and though we are, recording a podcast, we should see a fair amount of stabilization in the nervous system, unless this is something that is provoking a lot of anxiety or stress. Naturally, because we're talking and communicating, heart rate variability is going to be suppressed somewhat. Heart rate is going to be inflated somewhat, but for most people, not going to be significantly away from their baseline. But if you were to go and do a really high intensity workout right now, or go do some kettlebell swings or pull ups or push ups, we're going to see a significant impact on the nervous system, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Again, that's actually inherently a good thing. Stabilization should really occur when we're in kind of moments like this. I would almost like to say like active rest, or when we're working, or when we're not like actively engaging in movement, like strong movement, any type of intensive exercise. Because no, you would expect, as you mentioned, to see a significant inflation in heart rate and a significant reduction in heart rate variability when we're doing more of these transient acute type of trainings or exercises. That's bound to happen. But if you're on, let's say, on a commute and you're just sitting in your car listening to whatever, a podcast or an audiobook, and somebody cuts you off in traffic, or you're stuck in traffic and your nervous system is just going nuts. Well, now we're getting some really high quality information that you're not really doing anything that would require a lot of energy mobilization from a physiological perspective, because you're just sitting there. But now we're tapping into more of how these psychological stressors are impacting your overall physiology. And that's where we can intervene.
Mm-hmm. Most people are sympathetic dominant, but what about for those that are parasympathetic dominant? Like my partner, she always has HRV scores that are through the roof, and I'm jealous, but I recognize you can't compare between individuals. But there seems to be like the division between people who are sympathetic and versus parasympathetic dominant.
Yeah. In the end, one of the things that we know is that personality plays, is key here. Genetics are key as well. Some people just genetically have a higher HRV than others, regardless of whether or not they're psychologically impacted by a lot of stress, or if they're sedentary or whatever it may be. A lot of people just have a genetic propensity. So again, that's why we need to know our baseline, and we need to know how often are we shifting away from it, how often are we staying well below our baseline. That's more indicative than just looking at kind of the number in and of itself. There are some other more advanced biometrics related to heart rate variability that give us way more insight than that. So high frequency domains in heart rate variability are a great representation of overall vagal activity and actually allow us to look at more of the parasympathetic response. And so we're building a lot of that into Hanu to utilize it as a key metric as well. So that's a really good one to look at. But I would say that if, a lot of it is all about response, because people who are more parasympathetically dominant aren't individuals that necessarily have a high HRV. These are actually individuals who are able to engage in autonomic control very easily. And so kind of like I always kind of refer to these people as that, like, these are kind of like the natural stoics. I am an individual who's not a natural stoic. I have to work to be a stoic. I have to put in a lot of practice. There are some people I know that are just naturally stoic. Like, you throw a rock at them and they just kind of laugh. Like, they're like, no, not a big deal. They just are naturally these easygoing people. I am not. I'm a very type A personality. I'm very just kind of like active. My mind's always going. We might even refer to it as ADHD at times. Like, I'm just one of those people. And so I have to work hard to activate my nervous system. I have to conscientiously do that. And there's some people who just naturally, like, they do it. And like, they experience a stressor, heart rate variability doesn't budge, heart rate doesn't budge. For me, I might experience a stressor and it's like, boom, like heart rate goes up, heart rate variability goes down. Not inherently a bad thing if it goes up and stays up and I'm not controlling it. That's where we get detriment. So it's really just kind of knowing thyself, and it brings in the piece of emotional regulation, right? Like, that's a key component to know. It's like, are you somebody that when something happens in your life, like, you have a quick fuse, like, it's really easy for you to get upset, like, you externalize and behaviors happen that you regret? Or are you somebody who's like really good at just like, when things come at me, like, I have great temperance and like I do not allow it to affect me that much? That's more of like the parasympathetic dominant individual, and the sympathetic dominant individual is one that like is typically maybe a little bit more on edge, maybe a less temperate, maybe a little bit more anxious or neurotic. But yeah, so it's kind of like know thyself, and then you can use your numbers to your advantage.
Yeah. Well, Jay, I'm going to let you get back to building Hanu pretty soon, but a couple other things before we start wrapping up. And that was when I first downloaded the app, started using the service. I immediately was drawn to what you call the resonance frequency assessment and also the Bolt scores. What are those, and why did you include them in your service?
Yeah, great question. So resonance frequency is actually a term that was coined by Dr. Paul Lehrer and colleagues. He's a Rutgers professor emeritus, and he's actually sits on our board of advisors. He's a professor with over 100 citations in the HRV biofeedback field. About 3 decades or so ago, he coined the term resonance frequency because he found that individuals, and he and his colleagues, I should say, found that that individuals will breathe at a rate, if they breathe at a rate that resonates with their nervous system, then this will increase overall heart rate variability amplitude and will also increase subjective feelings of relaxation and recovery. So resonance is really referring to the resonance of your cardiorespiratory system, as well as resonance of your autonomic nervous system. So this is a rate that will resonate. And so it ranges anywhere from 4.5 breaths per minute at its lowest to its highest to 6.5 breaths per minute. And we found that all adults have a range, or have a number within 4.5 to 6.5 that is kind of their resonant rate. And it does not change throughout their life as far as we know it today. Research may change on that, but as far as we know it today, it's like once you find your resonant rate, like that's the rate that you practice at. So within our app, you can take the full protocol. This is the scientifically published and validated protocol created by Paul Lehrer himself. And it's a 12-minute assessment. You start breathing at rates from 6.5 all the way down to 4.5. And then at the end, you're provided with an output, and we say this is your resonant rate. And from then on, when you do resonance breathing training, that rate will populate and you'll breathe at that rate. So you'll go into your resonance breathing under exercises, and you can set it for however long you want to do it, and you'll breathe at that pace. So for instance, mine is 5 breaths per minute. So I breathe at 5 breaths per minute pace on the resonance breathing exercise. We just know that, like, from an HRV biofeedback perspective, it is single-handedly the greatest or most evidence-based type of breathing for biofeedback. So it is our bread and butter, resonance breathing. So that's what we use there. And then BOLT score is the body oxygen level test. This is actually a CO2 tolerance test that was developed by another one of our advisors, Patrick McCune, who wrote the Oxygen Advantage. He also co-host our Hanu Health podcast. Basically, it is a mechanism for looking at dysfunctional versus functional breathing. And we know that at certain rates, especially if you're below, let's say, 20 seconds of the BOLT score, then that's indicative that you likely have some significant problems with dysfunctional breathing. When you go above 20, especially into the 30 range, now we're talking about more functional breathing patterns that people have because you have better CO2 tolerance. Above 40 is the aim. So we want to get everybody above 40 on their BOLT score. So we have that there as a mechanism of tracking, and you can look to see how some of the practices that you've been doing, how are they impacting overall BOLT score? Are you increasing your overall CO2 tolerance, which we know has significant benefits from an overall health, wellness, and longevity perspective. So these are two that we really wanted to put in there because we think that they are extremely important in both learning kind of the mechanisms of appropriate breathing pace with resonance breathing, and then also learning better ways to tap into appropriate biochemistry with the BOLT score. So yeah, we love having those in there as a mechanism for, especially the BOLT score, for tracking over time.
Yeah, it's really cool. And you're one of the few companies I've seen that actually integrate those into the HRV testing service, because those, like you said, the resonance frequency assessment, you learn that once, and then whenever you need some nervous system regulation, you know your optimal inhale, exhale frequency. And then the BOLT score, I first came across that, like you were saying, in Patrick McEwen's Oxygen Advantage book, and it was interesting to see that come up in an app.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, indeed. More to come. More to come.
We'll have another conversation if you're open to it down the line about CO2 tolerance and changes, other assessments. But for now, if people are interested in picking up Hanu or connecting with you guys, how do they go about that?
Yeah, so we are starting shipping out in October. So we have it out to a group of alpha and beta users right now. But the everyday consumer will be able to have access come October. We're sending out the first week of October. Just head on over to Hanu Health. So it's HANU. And if anybody's wondering, Hanu is Hawaiian for breath. So hanuhealth.com. You can order it there. We're giving everybody right now a significant discount off of our retail price. So you get the device plus 12 months of service, or we call it membership, 12 months of membership for $299. So a little bit under $300, a dollar under $300. But I believe we have a discount code for you, Nick. I just don't remember it offhand. And if we don't have you one, we'll get you one that we'll get it for 40% off.
Yeah, the code you gave me is Urban.
Urban. There we go. So then I'll give you 40% off. So that makes a $300 device only $180. So we think that there's a lot of inherent value there for $180. So we tell people, get in early, be the early adopter, and you'll reap the benefit of getting it really cheap. But on the flip side, as any early adopter, you'll get to ride the roller coaster of the fun tech waves with us, because they come and go with early tech. But early adopters who buy into things early, they completely understand. But you get to see the evolution. You get to see all the really amazing, awesome things that are coming down the pike, and we're adding basically every week.
Mm-hmm. In a local gym, they offer the resonance frequency assessment, and they were charging over $100 for that alone.
Wow. So. Well, there you go. You get it right in the app, and then you get to use it and practice with it. So that's cool that a gym's doing that. I've never heard of that. You get the device and for 12 months for basically just a little bit more than that.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, Jay, we'll start to wind down. We'll ask you one more question, and then we'll do a quick rapid fire round.
Let's go.
Imagine all knowledge on Earth is lost. You get to save the works of 3 teachers. Who would you choose and why?
We already talked about Stoic philosophy. So two of these are going to be Stoics. The first one would be Marcus Aurelius. My go-to book that I've probably read more than any is Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. Just amazing philosophy of life and living the four virtues of Stoic philosophy: temperance, wisdom, justice, and courage. So that would be my number one. Number two would probably be the works of Seneca. Seneca was another philosopher. One of my favorite books in the entire world were his moral letters. So I really thought that it was. It's just another kind of amazing, practical, easy to understand guide. It's unlike other philosophy books, and it just kind of tells you, hey, this is kind of some of the things that we have learned to live by. And the other one would be the works of Viktor Frankl. So if people are not familiar with him, they might be familiar with one of his books at least, which is Man's Search for Meaning, which is one of the most incredible books I've ever read in my life. It is short, but man, is it powerful about one's journey to find meaning and purpose and value under the most horrid conditions that were the Holocaust, and when he's lost everybody in his life. So that would be my third. Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and Viktor Frankl.
Beautiful. And I've read all of those. And for the first two, you can get that encapsulated with some modern commentary in the book you referenced earlier, which is Ryan Holiday's Daily Stoic, which I love also.
Indeed, for sure.
Okay, we'll do a quick rapid fire round and we'll call it a day.
Let's go.
What area of your own health and performance are you currently working on?
Mental health, always. But more particularly right now, mental health, emotional regulation. I kind of was saying earlier, like it's easy for me as a type A neurotic individual, highly driven, to let things get to me if it's not going kind of the way that I drew it up. And I'm learning to better let go of that and show better temperance.
Are there any particular myths around HRV that you wanted to dispel?
Yeah, that higher is better. Higher is not better. Your average is better. Well, when we're looking at HRV, like so many people will try to compare to others. Oh, mine is 20 and I saw another person had 120. Like, that's not good. I'm going to die. I have bad, quote unquote, HRV. No, there's a lot of variables that we're not considering there. What we want is stability. Like, we want really for you to be average, to be your average is what I should say, and not comparing to others. Higher can be better when you're practicing for it to be better. And we can do so through increasing cardiorespiratory fitness. We can do so through HRV biofeedback conditioning and training. But the goal shouldn't be, let me inflate or raise my HRV. That is just a byproduct. That's just the data that demonstrates that what you're doing is actually affecting change there. What the goal should be is, let me train my nervous system to listen to me when I talk to it. That's the goal.
What's one thing that you're interested in or researching these days?
Oh, that's a good one. So the nerdy side of me is we're looking at like advanced processing of data and algorithms for assessing and estimating tidal volume of breathing with EKG, which is like such a nerdy thing. But that is it's fascinating information and new research to me, and stuff that obviously will go and be input for Hanu. The other thing is just overall leadership and creating a really good quality culture within my business. So as a co-founder of Hanu, just learning how to integrate just better techniques and tactics and communication skills. I think overall leadership is a really high concern for me.
Mm-hmm. Finally, what's one thing that your tribe doesn't know about you?
This sometimes comes out, but I'm a really goofy individual. Like when I am like out of work and out of like this context, especially when I'm with family, like I'm just a very goofy individual. I love cracking jokes. Like I just like being stupid, like, and having just like crazy dumb fun. Like I used to just be like a huge like prankster when I was younger, and I still am. And so like my kids, like I see them developing just these really goofy personality traits and like saying just really odd, goofy things. And that is absolutely like who I am at my core. I'm just a goofy dude. And it's because like, I put on like the scientist hat and, the working professional hat and the owner of a company hat. And it's like, I don't want to, it's good to like have a level of reservation when you're doing that at times, but also just like, if I do it all day long, like I want to go home and just be freaking goofy and it's fun. Like I just like being stupid sometimes.
Well, I love that. And I hope to see you in a different context, in the goofy context, because I've seen it come out a little bit in other podcasts, but I'm looking forward to seeing that possibly in person someday.
It'll be there, man. You'll see it. If you're around me for enough time, like it's just inevitably it comes out. There's no way to avoid the goofiness.
Yeah. Any final thoughts today?
Dude, just, for people who are out there who always hear me talk about data and objective, biometrics and heart rate variability, like I always come down to this is like the data is great. All that information is great, but get down to the most simple things that can help you right now today without the use of technology, which is just like make sure you work on focusing on increasing better self-awareness to your response to stress and your state, and then better self-regulation through pacing your breathing, learning better biomechanics. If you do those things, like you will find a significant difference, no doubt about it.
Yeah, it can really be that simple.
Yep, for sure.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me today on the podcast. It's been a pleasure hosting you, and I look forward to trying and helping evolve Hanu with you.
Absolutely, man. Thanks so much for having me on.
I'm Nick Urban, here with Dr. Jay Wiles, signing out from mindbodypeak.com. Have a great week and be an outlier. I hope that this has been helpful for you. If you enjoyed it, subscribe and hit the thumbs up. I love knowing who's in the 1% committed to reaching their full potential. Comment 1% below so that I know who you are. For all the resources and links, meet me on my website at mindbodypeak.com. I appreciate you and look forward to connecting with you. As a reminder, the information depicted in this video is for information purposes only. Please consult your primary healthcare professional before making any lifestyle changes.